This panel is about how to build an ethical culture throughout an enterprise, which is a not insignificant challenge. There are always bad actors, but the question you always ask yourself is, have you done enough? How do you build that? How do you build the confidence throughout the organization that people know what's expected, how to act? And certainly compliance is an important part of this. And there should be a strong alliance between the communications organization and the compliance organization around building a culture of compliance. But you need to constantly ask yourselves, if your compliance culture is, we abide by all applicable laws, regulations, etc., and anything else is okay, then actually your culture is that you're going to get away with whatever you can get away with, and that's not a culture that anybody wants to have trust in. So it has to be more than that, and that's where the role of values and mission and purpose come in.
Compliance without ethics is ineffective. It becomes a check-the-box program. And in fact, there's been changes in the law, both in the United States as well as through OECD signatories, that now demand that organizations have, in addition to law compliance, a culture of ethics and integrity. And so increasingly, prosecutors, regulators, and other people who investigate malfeasance come in, and the very first thing they're looking to do is to find out, are they investigating rogue situations, or are they seeing something that is systemic, that is part of the culture of the organization? And obviously, they will attend to those investigations depending on how they view them through the process of uncovering facts. I've heard a lot of CEOs and very senior people talk about what our culture is here at our organization, is this, that, and something else, who have never actually gone out and tried to baseline what the culture is. Every organization has cultures and subcultures, and unless you go out and do a culture assessment, I would suggest that you don't know what your culture is. That culture is discovered through employee surveys, through focus groups, through interviews, and quite frankly, walking around and observing what appears to be the cultures in various organizations. We've learned that culture at headquarters is well understood in most organizations, and the further away from headquarters you get, the least it's understood and where the greatest risks are.
One of the things that we did at the Better Banking Project was ask the question of, what does trust mean today in financial services? Obviously, it's no surprise to anybody that there was a sort of historic loss of trust after the financial crisis in 2008. And what we started to realize was that when bankers talked about rebuilding trust and consumers talked about rebuilding trust, they were not really necessarily talking about the same thing. Most bankers will tell you when they talk about trust, they're talking about things like honesty, they talk a lot about full disclosure, or they're talking about fairness. Is everybody getting the same treatment? What consumers mean by trust today, post-crisis, is this notion of helpfulness, which is a very much deeper level of engagement than honesty or fairness. And when you think about what helpful means to a consumer, and when you think about how banks kind of conduct themselves and how they set themselves up, they're not really set up to deliver on helpful all the time, every day. And so the good news was, when we talked to bankers about this, we can identify in some respects what trustworthy means right now. But the bad news is that you can't do this on the cheap. Helpful is not just a different color of blue on the advertising campaign. It's not changing the PR messaging. It's really, how do you think about every single part of your business, and how does it roll up to drive helpfulness and drive trust?
Trust has to be earned, and the only way to earn trust is in relationship. So one tool that leaders practice, particularly when they're new to a company, is they'll pick a variety of people at different levels in their realms to work with. One thing, one little thing. Why do that? You find an opportunity to build your brand. Who you are, what your expectations are, what experience you deliver to them as a leader. Leadership is all about teaching people, how do you decide what to do when you don't know what to do? I mean, that's really the challenge of life and business, certainly in law. How do you decide what to do when you don't know what to do? What's the compass? And two, the human tendency when things go wrong is always to look for the bad apple. This went wrong because, we had a bad apple. We get rid of the bad apple and then we get rid of the problem. Well, it's not true. Bad apples happen because they're bad barrels. And the relentless search in every organization has to be, where are the bad barrels? Every time I had the opportunity to speak to employees anywhere in the world, I ended with, remember, here are Tom's 4 rules, and here's what they were. 1, everything with integrity. If we don't defend the culture, if we don't defend what's right, nobody else will. 2, everything with excellence. I used to call it the steeple of excellence because I would tell people you have a gift, your job should be your calling, and we talk a lot about what excellence means in context. 3, everything with confidence. Everybody's a leader, and you have to license people to lead, even if they're an assistant or a clerk or whether they're a C-suite executive. Everybody has a license to lead. You have to define for people what it is that means, and you have to ask them to apply it with confidence, because there is no trust if people sense insecurity and a lack of confidence. And finally, I think this is really important, I would tell people that, look, no matter what happens, and it will happen, we're not going to lose our sense of humor. Why? Because organizations have to be resilient in an ordeal of change. People want to have fun.
I run our credit card business. We have about $50 billion in assets, about 55 million customers. It's a fairly complex, diverse set of credit cards. Many of you probably have one in your wallet. And what I would say is, I truly believe that culture really starts at the top. And I'm very lucky to work in a company, GE, which is a company that I think, and I've worked in other places, is unique in terms of how it sets the tone at the top. And so I can tell you, when we go to a big meeting, every meeting starts with, integrity and compliance is a non-start. You'll be fired, don't even, step out of line. But I think the thing that makes that real is, at GE, we get measured on not only not only what we do, but how we do it. So what I would tell you, it's a values-based company. So if I hit all my numbers and I was like the star, but I was not behaving in the right way, and we have actual measures around this, and you get written up on these measures on the behavioral side, you're going to either be out of here or not get a raise or get a really very clear message. And I think the boundaries of how that's set inside our company actually sets the tone for the company. Being a CEO of a company, probably the most important thing you need to do, particularly in the times that we're in, is making sure that your team has voice at the table, that you're not a top-down leader telling everyone what they need to do, that you got to guide, you got to lead, but you really need to make sure your risk leader has voice. You really have to make sure your compliance leader has voice. You have to balance that out with the sales guys who want to do what they want to do. You have to build trust with the regulators, and it has to be a partnership, because they're gonna come in and see things they don't like, and we're gonna probably not like that they say those things about us. But I think we have to be smart enough to realize we got to make these changes, and we also have to create a level of trust where if something does go wrong, we can pick up the phone and call the regulator.
It seems to me that several of you made the point that culture has to be intentional. Every organization has a culture, but you kind of have to be really clear about defining what it is. And that culture has to lead to actual behaviors. So let me just tee that up, and I know several of you mentioned it, but would anyone like to give any more depth or comments about how you define the culture and the behaviors that you want?
There's this notion of what I call extreme self-reliance. And so there's a common refrain you hear from managers in a lot of banks, especially investment banks, which is, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. And in the best case, that can be encouraging people to think more like managers, to be creative problem solvers. But in the worst case, you're losing literally billions of dollars in a bad trade, and it takes you too long to raise this up to your superiors because you've been inoculated with this idea of I have to come with a solution and not a problem. And in fact, if you read through the JP Morgan whale incident and you look through the actual transcripts of telephone calls and the email messages, you'll see people saying, no, we don't want to tell so-and-so yet until we figure out what we're going to do about it. And this is actually months and billions of dollars into a bad trade. And so while JP Morgan is an organization, and I actually do have a lot of respect for a number of the executives there, as an organization, they are committed to risk management. But that notion of people have to come with solutions and not problems is really undercutting their ability to be effective risk managers. The
goal is to develop a culture that is sort of self-regulating and self-reinforcing. Let me use the school as an example. We have a terrible bullying problem in our country, and social media tools have really aggravated that. But there are schools that do not have a bullying problem. And one of the reasons they don't have a bullying problem, or it's very, very minimal and contained, is because the students themselves are part of a very strong culture of a school where they say to each other, you know what, we don't do that here. We don't do that here in this school. So the peer pressure actually runs the other way. So part of the goal of a leader when you're at the top is how do you inculcate the peer pressure that reinforces the values that you want.
I think there's also a notion around daily practice versus practice in extreme situations. So a lot of times we'll focus a lot on culture when there's a crisis. There's some kind of problem. There's been a massive breach of trust. When I think culture really gets built every day. And oftentimes the small decisions you make can be more important than the big ones because, oh, you let this one little thing slide and oh, this other one little thing and oh, this guy kind of did a sort of bad thing, but it's sort of okay and we'll let it go. And you get on that slippery slope, which very quickly leads to a complete erosion of your culture. So I think in addition to it being a lifelong practice, it has to be a very specific daily kind of sweat the small stuff practice too.
Every time we in business fail to set our own boundaries, there's only one alternative. Regulation. Government will come in and set it for us. And then we wake up one day today and we say, how the hell did we get here? You know, this has to become an era of self-regulation. And it has to get back to the essence of what today is all about, which is building trustful organizations. And literally, we've heard it from all the panelists, how do we develop a stakeholder approach? I believe Gen Y is pushing us, because of transparency and because of who they are, pushing us towards an extreme makeover of capitalism. It demands it. They want to work, as Roger said, work for a company, and as Tom said, work for a company that they're proud of, work with people that they admire and so forth. They're going to demand change in this world in ways that we, the kids of the 1970s, demanded change until we became capitalists in the 1990s. It's a very interesting process that we all go through. But I think there's an opportunity here, there's a defining moment here for us to try and leverage. One defining moment I saw in my lifetime was post 9/11, when I saw relationships get formed and people treat each other with a sense of civility that I had never experienced in my life. And I used to give some talks after 9/11, and I used to say, the biggest fear I have is someday we'll go back to business as usual. And we did.
We did.
And then following the Great Recession, I had the same hope that maybe this was a defining moment, because the reason we got into it is we created all sorts of moral hazards, and everybody was drunk at the trough of success. And all I kept hearing around the world was, I can't wait to go back to business as usual. So we need to take this time, this moment, right here, right now, and commit to change. That's what I believe.
We have to be partners with the regulators, and this word trust, I actually just had this conversation with one of my prime regulators yesterday. You know, you have to build trust with the regulators, and it has to be a partnership, because they're gonna come in and see things they don't like, and we're gonna probably not like that they say those things about us. But I think we have to be smart enough to realize we got to make these changes, and we also have to create a level of trust where if something does go wrong, we can pick up the phone and call the regulator. And I think if you have that mutual trust, no one likes making those phone calls, and I hope I don't really have to make some of those, but. I think it becomes a different relationship. It becomes a relationship where they're partnering with you, we're partnering with them, and then we're both successful.
When we think about trust and trustworthy organizations, it's the culture you have inside, it's also the culture that people are experiencing outside. And so I know I've talked to regulators who say, I would pull back if I knew that I could trust the banks were doing X, Y, and Z, and I didn't have to look over their shoulder. And I know in the banks, I talk to them, they're like, I now have literally 16 regulators asking me for the same information. And so if we can think about how to have stakeholder engagement, as we were just saying before, and so it's not just within your organization with the board and your employees, but it's your regulators, it's your shareholders, it's your customers, it's your business partners. That is really, I think, what the trustworthy organization looks like in the future.
Commitment at the top. Commitment throughout the organization. That's the peer pressure thing. That's hard to create, but that's important. Clear, constant communications, Tom's 4 rules. Incentives, Susan talked about that from the very beginning. Sort of closely related to that, measurement, performance evaluation, modeling behavior, training. Is that everything?
I think so.
Loyalty.
How do you do that?
I don't know, but that was something very big that got said. I thought that was one of the
Yeah, I think you're right, actually, and my sense of that is that mission and purpose is really important. It's not just values, what we believe and how we behave, but it's what's the value we create, and that value is certainly customer value and shareholder value, but it's societal value as well. People want to work for organizations that are creating good value in the world. And if you can inculcate that into your culture, we're an organization that creates broad societal value. That's where the loyalty comes from, in my opinion.